The aircruiser landed on the roof of the police VR diving facility, and they saw the huddled figure of head technician Harris waving to them from the walkway. His matted, curly, dirty blonde hair was bouncing in the wind. He was wearing goggles too large, a lab coat too small, and his feet were pointed inwards, twitching like a skier heading downhill. The wind picked up and screeched as soon as the aircruiser doors shot upwards. Above them, grey clouds had rolled in like tanks and made the world even darker. Harris bounded towards them, blocking one nostril, sending a bout of snot down onto the steel grating while playing with a fidget. "Hello, hello, hello," he called out loudly over the wind. Gong lifted his fur hat and gave him a salute. "How are you doing?" Lee asked. "I am doing very well, thank you," Harris said, constantly flicking at something on his feed with his right hand, while he slipped the fidget back and forth. "Everything is prepped and prepared. We have got you two something tasty cooking. Oh, it's gonna be something. You guys are going down into a treat of a locale, I tell ye." A steel hexagonal panel at the end of the walkway slid backwards. They descended a circling staircase, through a pale, glistening, labyrinthian hive of drones, projectors, consoles, and artificial lighting. Technicians and coders, some of them surrounded by floating projections, bustled everywhere. "Is it Tweedledee or Tweedlenee?" Harris asked another technician, slapping his knee while waving at them, causing them both to snort with laughter. "You freaks need some natural lighting down here," Gong said. "Starting to get sordid. When was the last time you had an office party?" "Oh, detective, we party every time we get a big shipment of new compute, believe me." Harris turned, lifted up his goggles, licked his lips, and gave them a wink. They stepped onto the ground floor, surrounded by heavy hardware and glowing wires. Harris brought up a projection of a highly detailed, annotated bird with a woman's head and breasts. "Oh, forgive me, that was just a little after-school project," he said, then waved it away, and brought up 3 streams of code, twirling like DNA. "These 2 gentlemen need to be served, Jeeves," Harris said to an android that looked like a butler from a historical play. "Quite so, sir, quite so," said the android butler, and adjusted his monocle. "Your table is just over here, gentlemen." The android led them to 2 upright VR pods shaped like giant eggs. The tops lifted up. Inside were 2 body-shaped compartments with viscous jelly pulsating at the rim. "Table 1 is reserved for Detective Lee," the android said, and indicated to the first pod. "And this one would be for Detective Gong." Lee and Gong took their suits. Lee felt the familiar nervousness starting to rise in his stomach. He stepped into the VR suit and began to zip it up to his neck. "I do apologize, gentlemen. We were afraid your table was a little too close to the kitchen," the android said. "But arrangements were made with the head chef." "That is I," Harris said, and flashed a projection of chef whites over his technician's uniform. "When was the last time you got laid, Harris?" Gong asked, leading back into the pod. "I've had the experience of the pleasure of the night," Harris said, turning slightly red. "Androids don't count," Gong replied. "Then I'm as pure as my mother always dreamed I would be," Harris said. "I don't know what you guys did to get a ticket on this old train, but believe me, you are about to leave the station." "What does that mean?" Lee asked. He leaned back into the pod and felt the cold clasp around his ankles, then his legs, then his chest. It was unpleasant, like being submerged in sticky cold gel. "It means, my good sir," Harris said, "that I am unable to tell much of what the very prestigious, heavily guarded VR domain you're about to venture down into entails, but I suspect it's going to be rather wild." "Good wild?" Lee asked, already feeling a little hazy. "What was good wild?" "You need to find each other," Harris said, more seriously. "Find yourselves, and remember who you are. I'll do what I can to stretch your time down there, but you're not going to have much more than an hour, if my calculations are correct. Which, checking me data again," he said, looking at a projection. They shall be." "Enough time for Jeeves to give you a much-needed haircut," Gong said slowly, as though already half asleep. "This is a gourmet restaurant, not a barber shop," the android said, sounding offended. "I've been told my hair is my best feature," Harris said. "By your mother," Gong said. "Ain't much else memorable about it." "Buckle up, buttercups," Harris said. "It's, what did they used to say? It's showtime." The android finalized the VR procedure, and Lee felt the cold press of material starting to find his neck like a hand pressing downwards. He felt that he was falling. He was falling. He was falling, and there were no guardrails.
He was falling. Everything was dark, darkening, darker, darkest.
Rusty feathers in the neon light, strumming chord sharp as midnight claws, throwing loud, breaking silence tight, stage on fire, burning through my flaws, barnyard blitz breaking from the pen, wings spread wide.
He was in a lighthouse. Then he was at the very top. He put his hands to the giant bulb before him. It span and span and span. He felt sick. He had to get out. He had to get down. Even if it meant to die, he had to get down. This was it. This was the method. This was his manifestation of the manifold ways to dive. But how could he get out? He walked around the lighthouse lantern, searching for a way down. There had to be a way. When the bulb of the lighthouse was facing out to sea, everything else was in darkness. He could hear the waves pounding against a crumbling cliff. He had to dive. This was it. He lunged outwards, down over the railing, and raced down, and there was the sea with a million flames like ice and blue fire, and he was smashing into the water, smashing down below. He smelt dust. He was breathing. He opened his eyes, but it was hard fought to see through them. Everything smelt old. He looked up at a badly painted ceiling, the corners stained with damp. The wallpaper was ornate and once fancy and considered, but time had made it dour and sad. The bedsheets were sweaty. He took back the blankets as his eyes adjusted to the light. There was one naked bulb above him, flickering a struggling shade of yellow, a handful of flies bashing their heads against it, as if trying to get inside. A typewriter was on a desk in the corner. There was a stack of bound paper and a revolver beside it. A giant window with 12 panes stretched to the ceiling. Rain was smashing against it, dripping on it like tears. The flash of vehicles came up through the city light and broke like trawlers in the dark. He was dressed in a suit, a silk handkerchief pressed in the top pocket. He felt his nose and hair. It was cut fresh, cropped, greased back like an axle. There was a snub-nosed revolver hidden in his jacket pocket, a knife in a brace fitted above his ankle. Where was he? What had happened? Was it a party? Why didn't he put his revolver away? He walked, struggling like someone too drunk, to the worn desk and felt the cold steel of the revolver upon it. He opened the chamber. It was loaded. He felt inside his suit, a pressed shirt, expensive, exquisite, a real leather holster. The revolver slipped inside it, perfectly. He liked the feel of it there. Mirror. He had to find a mirror. Why? He didn't know. But it was there like the unresolved feelings that linger like flotsam and jetsam after a moving dream. For he had dreamed, he remembered that much. He had dreamed he was a detective in a distant and unusual place. Whatever party he had spent the night at had washed his senses far. There was a bathroom. Good. He could freshen up. He stepped into the ill-lit fluorescence of a cracked sink, stained toilet, and clawed-footed bathtub. There was a mirror above the sink. It was rusted, the sheen was gone, but he saw himself. He turned the tap. The water glowed, strangely blue and green, and flowed slower than he thought water flowed. He rinsed his face and looked at himself. He looked about 40. Clean-shaven, a few greys, but thick hair. He was handsome, in a classic, masculine way, grizzled, a scar on his cheek. He looked like a man to be taken seriously, one who had known fistfights in his youth and shootouts in his prime. But he was calmer now. He could feel that. What had happened yesterday? What had happened for all the time before that? Who was he? He reached inside his jacket and found a pristine silver case of hand-rolled cigarettes and a business card. Valentino Lee, private investigator, 51 Sunset Avenue, dawn till dusk. Sunset Avenue? Was that where he was now? Did he have a client? Was he on a case? Got distracted at the party? What had he taken? How much had he drank? He went back to the desk. Nothing in the typewriter. He opened the drawer, found some matches, a half-drank bottle of whiskey, ammunition, a pocket watch, a handkerchief stained with lipstick. He opened the other drawer, and there was an invoice typed up. Case 1673. Client Harris Jeeves. A costly reminder from the other side, my friend. Find out who you are. Find out who Detective Gong is, and remember when you come back up. Find Gong? Who was that? Costly? Did he even have any money? Maybe he'd been robbed last night, and that was the cause for this amnesia. Lee checked the drawers, but found nothing else useful. He looked in the bedside table, and there was a billfold filled with paper dollars, about 500 or so. That was something. Well, he had work and money at least. If he could get a coffee and a smoke, maybe a shot of whiskey to clear his head, he could figure out how he'd ended up here, then find this Detective Gong. But why was the client invoice so obscure? Where was he meant to begin? He walked over the thin, ratty carpet, scarred with cigarette burns, grabbed the matches, took a shot of whiskey and lit a smoke. There was a suave, wide-rimmed white hat matching his suit on the hook by the door. He put it on and opened the door, expecting to step out into a corridor. But instead he was in a small office, with a green leather chair and a glistening dark wooden desk. An elegant woman with a dog on her lap was sat on the other side of the desk, waiting. It's about time, Valentino, baby. You've kept this doll waiting for nearly 10 minutes. Sorry, Lee said, and without thinking, sat down in what must have been his chair. It's all right, baby, the woman said. But I did tell you I'd be here when the clock struck 7. She looked at him with a pouting expression. She looked rich in an absurd way. Tutu will be getting very, very hungry if him and Mummy don't get back soon. And we came here to give you a little tip too. What's that? Lee asked. She put a cigarette to her mouth in a long golden holder. Lee lit it for her with a match. We just happen to know where Illinois Slim is gambling tonight. As she said it, she seemed to savor the words, watching Lee for a reaction. He didn't know who Illinois Slim was. How had he forgotten so much? He lit a cigarette for himself. That's so, Lee said. And where would that be? That oaf is down at the Blue Moon Brewery, and something tells me it's time for a little shakedown. I want my silver back, Mr. Lee. You took my money, and you promised it clean. You found it was Slim who conned me, and I thank you for that. But now I want the job finished. You have to press him. I want it back in full by tomorrow, or I'm going to escalate this. Escalate it? Lee said, and let out a breath of smoke. To the administrators, the lady said coldly, her entire face seeming to twist. Then she was back in all her aromatic beauty. Come along then, Tutu. Let's leave the nice man to his business. She lifted the cigarette holder and tapped the ash into the tray as Lee slid it across the table. I'll be back same time tomorrow evening, and I expect my money. You'll be well compensated, of course. She turned sharply and carried her dog from the room. Lee took a pencil from the cup stamped with his name and a notebook from the drawer. He wrote, Illinois Slim, Blue Moon Brewery, get money for client. But who was the client? She obviously knew him. Was she connected to Harris Jeeves? Maybe it didn't matter. It sounded serious, and he hadn't liked what had happened to her face when she'd mentioned the administrators, whoever they were. Cops? Big cops? He still knew a few in the department, he was sure of that. At least he could find this bar, check out this Slim character. He put the notebook in his pocket, checked the revolver was fully loaded, and gave his appearance one last glance in the mirror. He pulled back the door to his office, expecting to come into a corridor as faded and worn as his office. But it looked nothing like it. It looked like a different building entirely. The ceiling was a curved mosaic. The style of the walls changed every few meters. There was even a section like a glass aquarium tunnel further along. Every door in the corridor was different. Some of them were of dark paneled wood. Others were more like steel vault doors. Others mirrored glass. One door slid upwards on a strange mechanism as he walked past. Inside, he saw golden light coming from the ceiling. In the center of the tiled room was a pool of water in an overflowing tank. A man crafted like a statue. Each muscle carved and shaped was holding an equally perfect young woman in his arms. He carried her into the water, and the door shut just as Lee saw a waiter bringing them glasses of sparkling drink. He followed the corridor, perplexed, realizing that some of the doors were tiny, only up to his waist. Others were as tall as the ceiling. Before he got to the very end of the corridor, he saw a metal cage in an elevator box with an elderly attendant waiting. "Going down, Mr. Lee?" the attendant asked. "Yeah," Lee said, and lit another cigarette. The man seemed to know him. He must have. Lee probably passed him every day, but again, like everything else, there was no recollection. Had to pass. This amnesia, surely, had to pass. The attendant pulled the lever, and the iron cage rumbled and began to creak downward with exposed cogs glinting with fresh oil. A dial above them with no other markings began to swing from right to left. "Have a good evening, Mr. Lee," the attendant said as the cage rolled into the lobby. He pulled the bars back for Lee to get out. The lobby was so large that Lee could barely even see the entranceway doors. The floor was veined marble. Everything simmered under candlelight, pressed leather chairs, silver chandeliers, glazed painted lamps, and giant scenic portraits shining gracefully. A group of men in pinstripe suits passed him on their way into the elevator. One was flicking a coin. Another was shuffling a deck of cards. "If you don't mind, Buster," one of them said, and pushed past him. There was a group of intellectual types by the foyer counter. They were dressed in tweed, and like every other guest he had seen, absolutely perfect looking. But perfect looking in a way that matched their style. The lady's blonde hair was tied in swirling curls or tucked up in buns, and the men had cropped hair, leather patches on their elbows. They spoke with a sophisticated air of the most important and intelligent people in the world. "Well, I do say that's a bit of a stretch for such a forceful adjective, wouldn't you say? Can you believe the way he just dandily slid into all that superficial exposition while completely ignoring the substance of my position? Yeah, now I'd hardly call that a starting point for a campaign in this season." "Well, good evening, Mr. Lee. What can I do for you?" the clerk at the counter asked. Lee was about to speak, then fell silent for a moment, taken aback. The clerk looked exactly the same as the elevator operator, but in a different uniform. Perhaps they were brothers or twins. "Nothing," Lee said. Actually, I was heading to the Blue Moon Brewery. Could you call me a cab?" "Certainly, sir." The clerk stepped over to a large bronze telephone and ordered the taxi, while Lee surreptitiously looked around. None of this was even vaguely familiar, but everyone seemed to know him. How long had he been living and working here? He had an hour, he suddenly thought. An hour. And he had to find Slim. And Gong. He had an hour to find Detective Gong. He heard the sound of quick footsteps, and looked over as a group returning from what must have been a fancy dress party crossed the lobby. The men had narrow eyes, tan skin, thick eyebrows, and long flowing cloaks of silk. Their hair was tied by red ribbons and fell as far as their waists. They carried swords that glinted like real steel in the light of the chandeliers. There was a woman with them too. She was carrying a spear and looked like an assassin. What kind of hotel was this? As they saw Lee staring, they matched his gaze. One of the men subtly put a hand to his sword. "The taxi cab is here now, sir," the attendant said, giving Lee a good reason to turn back. "It's here already?" "Yes, sir." He walked across the marble lobby. It was so large that it took several minutes. A pool of carp swam softly in a pond cut into the floor. Lee looked a little closer and saw one of the fish had what looked like bulging human eyes. He didn't look back again as the attendant held open the rotating doors to outside. As Lee stepped out into the night, he saw the door attendant was the same man as the lift operator and the counter clerk. No brother, no twin, the very same man.